I imagine that 2020 will make the history books. And so if you set yourself 10 years out into the future and think back to what are those triggers that will impact our behavior, which will impact our experiences as individuals, as employees, as leaders, and therefore it helps direct us in the design of the future workplace. The screen that you're seeing, the slide I should say that you're seeing on the screen right now, looks at what we're experiencing today in this kind of short-term mode. And some of this will carry over into our long-term thinking, but we thought we would start here and just kind of lay out for you some of the issues and tactics that we've been focusing on as designers in helping businesses ready as they bring people back into their workforce. Certainly there has been a lot of focus on indoor air quality. So we've seen some changes and reactions to our mechanical systems, our HVAC systems. Certainly, we've seen companies put in place new rules and protocols. Do you wear a mask? Do you get to use the microwave? Do you get to use the galley in the kitchen? There's been a lot of focus on sanitization on a personal basis, when you're out in public, and certainly within our workplaces as well. And the other thing that has really impacted change is technology. I know that we have several clients who are very prepared for this distribution of their workforce, our sort of crash course in working from home. But we have many clients who had never done a Zoom meeting before, who had to hurry up and purchase new software and new hardware to kind of ready their workforce to work from home. So we need to kind of think from a perspective of each company is starting from a different standpoint right now, and kind of keep that in mind as we go through scenarios and perspectives on the future. The other thing that I thought I would share with you very quickly, we at DLR Group have done a lot of work on surveying all sorts of sectors and clients, conversations with clients, and clearly our surveys have changed since 4 months ago when we all thought we would be at this for a couple of weeks through now. But what I wanted to share as sort of food for thought for our conversations coming up are just a few perspectives, the feedback that we have received on what are the positive things that we have learned from our remote work experience, and what are those things that will drive us back into the workforce. So when we look at on the positive side, the number one thing that we've seen is the shortened commute. Individuals save, it's not uncommon to save an hour a day, 5 hours a week. So that is very high on the list of benefits of working from home, as well as greater flexibility, maybe greater focus on life balance. And then we also take a look at work modes of individuals. So throughout the day, there are various tasks that we might be performing, and we always look at breaking those into modes or modalities. So we look at hard focus and soft focus and socialization, restoration, and what we found is that most individuals will say that working from home has been a better experience for really concentrated focus, for creative tasks that require, again, more of a isolated or autonomous mindset, and then certainly also restoration, which is something that most of us forget to do throughout the day. On the flip side, however, when we look at drivers for getting back into the workforce, we look at those same work modes, and we've seen that socialization, as an example, is much better, much more productive in a work environment. That culture in itself is something that has really been hit hard during this pandemic and our remote working. Similarly, collaboration is something that is much more robust when it's face-to-face, as is learning and mentoring and teaching. Again, much more productive when we can be face-to-face versus what I consider this two-dimensional Zoom meeting or even text messages, especially individuals that are coming new into the workforce. And then last, we have to remember that for some people, the work from home experience has been, if they have 2 kids at home, or there maybe don't have a home office, the work from home experience hasn't been as great. And so many individuals are looking forward again to getting back into more of a controlled environment. So just things for us to keep in mind, and as we look long term at What are the pros and cons of working from home, and what will this mean? Does it mean that we'll work more from home as well as working into the office? So give that some thought. And before I pass it off to Betsy, the other thing that I want to reiterate is I've just mentioned some things about working, about our work life. And I think the other thing that we have to respect in all of that we have experienced over the past few months is how much this has impacted our behaviors, our routine on a personal basis. Individuals who now run out over the lunch hour and walk their dog, or individuals who are focusing more on mental and physical well-being. I personally happen to live along the River Road, and that has been closed for the past few months. And it's very interesting to see the number of individuals and couples and families that are walking and running and bicycling so much more than we've seen in the past. And as I've had conversations with my neighbors, we have to wonder, is there any aspect of this change in our routines, again, that will carry forward long term? So again, as we prepare for the conversation, this very futuristic conversation, I just want to encourage everybody again to be kind of thinking bigger picture on this. So with that, I'm now going to turn the microphone over to Betsy to kind of help set the framework for our conversations this afternoon.
Well, thanks, Janice. I love that insight at the end of your discussion around really being cognizant of how your life has changed for the better, because I try to also think a lot about, we've really pivoted in society around how we do work, but there's a lot of benefits to the things that are happening right now that I think we want to set the lens of this conversation really about the next 5 to 10 years and thinking about exactly what Janice said. How has my everyday life improved a little bit related to work? And then also, let's be visionaries. Let's start to think about the long-term vision of what work can be. Janice and I spent a lot of really fun conversations thinking about this discussion and really thinking about what do we want to hear from you about. And it really, I think there's such great research, there's such great learnings about what's happening now, but we really want to push it forward and have this entire kind of conversation be about, because of 2020, both the pandemic and this pivot in social justice and social change, how are we really going to think about workplace and communities 5 to 10 years from now? So we together framed up sort of these 5 lenses to look at the idea of workplace through these sort of vertical categories. And then I think Abby will explain to you how that will actually work when you do breakout sessions. But, you know, workplace is really important. And I think workplace is really sort of becoming a topic du jour. I think it's affected everyone's life. It really is the major institution that we really live and interact with. Everybody goes to work in some way. It's where people have friendships. As Janice said, it's where people grow. It's where they learn. And it's a physical thing. I think we can do a lot of great things remote, but there's a lot of interpersonal exchange that happens in a work environment. And so that, coupled with diversity, we really want to think about how can we be more innovative, how can we remove barriers, how can we be more creative, and then really think about that through these 5 lenses. So the first is really social change. So what are the social constructs that are going to be different in 5 to 10 years? I think we're seeing radical change in 2020, thinking, you know, getting outside of today, thinking about in 5 years, 10 years, what systems will be in place for people in work environments? What would a neighborhood feel like? You know, Janice just mentioned her neighborhood has behave differently because during the workday, people are actually outside in the environment, they're doing different things. How might that change in 5 to 10 years? How might that idea of walking your dog at lunch not be sort of a special anomaly, but maybe the norm? What movements what will they be like in 5 to 10 years? And then how is that going to affect design? I think social change is really affecting all the constructs that we have in society right now. So we really want your thoughts on how will that affect workplace. The next big piece is the environmental changes. You know, we have come, I think, a long way in thinking about sustainability and being cognizant, especially in the work environment and commercial office buildings, around building performance, being sustainable, you know, green cleaning, all these things that are really great for the environment, but are really counter to the extreme need for cleaning and mechanical controls and filtration during a pandemic. So how is the work environment in offices going to really kind of pivot around that? Because it's really counter to sustainable thinking. So what might be the new constructs in the future that would be healthy and really adaptable to a pandemic, but yet really kind of thinking about how is that good for the environment long term? And then I think a big piece, Janice talked about this too, is mental and emotional changes. You know, in workplace design, we don't spend enough time or really any time thinking about mental or emotional feelings as we design work environments. I think 2020 has given us a new lens to do that. I think what would we want to expect our workplaces to do to support healthy mental health, to support people's emotional well-being while in the workplace? How does that affect the culture of an office? How might those things really kind of play into empathy? You know, workplace design can be empathetic, and how do we respond to that in 5 and 10 years? What would the work environment really feel like around those topics, and really designing for those really kind of, I think, really important components of how people behave and live. And then we also thought a great discussion would be around leadership. There's going to be a lot of change. You know, the younger generation of millennials and Gen Z, they're going to be leaders in the next 5 to 10 years. How are they going to lead differently? How is workplace leadership management going to change based on this pandemic, based on social change? What does that look like? What does transparency look like? What are their expectations of each other and themselves when they think about being a leader in an office? That's really important. I think Janice and I have talked a lot about, as leaders, how our behavior has changed to sort of connect digitally with our teams, but also be more transparent and connected to people's emotional health and really being more accessible. I think that is a great kind of change and pivot that potentially will carry on in the future. And then finally, what are the physical and spatial changes that might happen in real estate? We are all working remote. There's going to be a physical comeback to the work environment in the next 5 to 10 years. What might that balance look like? What are the expectations of the physical environment when you go back to the office in 5 or 10 years? Why would you go there? And then what would happen technology-wise to support work, not just in the office, but other places? So these are 5 big lenses that we've framed up for the conversation today. It's a dreaming conversation. It's about, you know, what potentially is the vision of the future. And I think Abby will explain to you kind of how we want you to tackle these categories. But thanks for your time, and we're excited to be with you.
Thank you, Betsy. Yeah, so just to give you a couple of breakout room instructions, you're going to spend like 20 to 25 minutes in the breakout room. There's going to be about 7 people or so in a breakout room. And first, when you get into the breakout room, introduce yourselves to your group members and identify a note taker and a group representative. And then there's going to be a link that is shared in the chat. So watch the chat for the link. And that's where you're going to capture your ideas, you know, as you take notes in your breakout room. And we encourage everyone to participate as you discuss the questions. And the questions will also be in the chat as well. So once again, the main focus is for you to discuss how will the experience of work change over the next 5 to 10 years and drive post-pandemic workplace design solutions long-term. So that's the question you're going to focus in the breakout room. For now, I think you're being split up into groups, and once you see a breakout room show up on your, click to accept, and then you go to the breakout room.
Notes from this, so.
So welcome everyone back from the breakout room. We're just going to wait a few seconds to have everyone join us back. I see 58 people. We had maybe we lost some people along the way, but welcome back, you know. Yeah. So I would like to invite representatives from different groups to share one key idea and just some general ideas. You could keep muted, keep the video off unless when you're speaking. It might help, you know, the rest of the group. So I'd just like to invite some representatives from the different groups to share one key idea. Maybe Virajita.
Yeah, I wonder if just calling out breakout groups one by one might be helpful, Abby. I was in breakout room 7, and so Edie or Ebtehal, would you like to report back? And feel free to use the chat as well, others who want to share.
Yes.
Sure, and I just turned my my speaker on here. So we had a great conversation about how different everyone's experiences are depending on not only their home situation, but really feel like next 5 to 10 years, this hybrid system, I really don't see it going away. I think it's offered people so much more and businesses so much more. For instance, in our firm, we've been able to actually hire somebody that doesn't even live in Minnesota. So and we're small, we're 9 people, but we had a former student who moved to Chicago and moved there with the intent of a job being available that ultimately ended up not being available because of the pandemic. But it allowed us to bring him back on with us to be able to continue working and continue to already know our firm from his previous time as a student at the University of Minnesota before he left. So the idea of technology, I think, changing is a very real possibility. I can see platforms like Zoom, platforms like from other companies like Microsoft actually becoming tailored to the industry. There's been times when we've had to use the annotation on Zoom to talk about details when we're working on projects, and it is pretty clunky. So I definitely see a development there that would happen that would support the architecture industry in ways that we're anxious to get to. And then Paul brought up some really interesting conversations around equity and inclusiveness, not just how we've been talking about it locally, but internationally. Her family and in Egypt has different opportunities to access some of these platforms that are not so they're not going to be as affordable. So it's becoming, there's equity that's global. It's not just here local that we need to work on those problems. And I'll mute myself for others. Thanks.
Thank you, Edie. I would like to invite Amy, Rob, Chris, Tom, Liv, or Teresa from Breakout Room 6. Breakout Room 6, if there was a representative who wants to share one thought.
Rob, why don't you go ahead? You were putting some things in the chat.
Sure. Yeah, one idea we had, or that came up, was how with remote work being so big now, no one person shows up to work anymore. That they have an entire brand. That's the kids that run through the background, the dog, the books they have on their bookshelf behind their head. There's a lot more involved in bringing someone into a remote workplace like this, because you can't hide as kind of this pressed shirt leader anymore. We're much more complicated.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah. And we also talked about the challenges of work life and home life's blurring, and the good of that, the flexibility, but also the potential for exploitation of workers as an issue.
At this point, Virajita, I wonder if there are any thoughts that are popping up in the chat that you'd like to share.
Yes, there are actually. Anne Snowdy had a great question, maybe coming from the group. How do we teach our younger students going forward and keep them learning to their full potential? It has been a challenge. I think my chat just moved here. For most families with their kids learning at home, there's also a challenge of technology equity. And on that note, I wanted to mention that in our group, we just talked about something I had heard where some families are creating pods and hiring private tutors to teach their children and so on. So talking about equity is really broader than only the technology and learning for kids. There's also breakout group 1, we too thought about the hybrid and need for to balance and focus work that's with socializing and collaborating. We wondered about designing protocols when you're in the office, both from an architecture and interior space perspective. Then there were insights from group 9. Would group 9 like to share, Jesse?
Hi, sorry, I had to unmute there.
No worries.
Yeah, we had a really nice discussion just about, you know, the work and careers kind of shifting from being less about the workplace and more about the workforce and who the people are. And our group had all expressed how they have enjoyed being able to work and live in the same space, but are really missing that social interaction and collaboration. So how are workplaces finding spaces and tools for collaboration, and then also being, you know, more purposeful about finding those times to collaborate and get together. And similar to the first discussion, just that we don't think this will go away now that people have been able to work from home and prove to their employers that it can be done. Will this encourage a shift that, you know, you might be able to work for a company that's based in New York City, because why not? We're all remote anyways. So how will just the global workforce and even just the US workforce change because of that?
Great, thank you, Jesse. Chris has posted something in the chat about another group. Would you like to share?
So I'm also from breakout group 1, and, you know, similar to what the other groups are sharing, we miss the social interaction, which you can't capture through Zoom meetings.
That's right.
Yeah.
As an example, I work in the medical school at the U of M. I have a design background, but I'm an administrator in the medical school, and so the component of how we all interact in a new way, but also as we interact with healthcare workers who are exposed to COVID patients, you know, how we safely return people to the workplace, which happens to be a medical setting.
And that was followed by Rebecca's comment in the chat. One thing her group discussed is a new way to greeting one another that isn't involving shaking hands. That may become a thing of the past.
Yeah, we were thinking it probably should become a thing of the past, even if the pandemic weren't to be. It seems very patriarchal, however you would say that. Anyway, it is not, it seems that people are judged perhaps by the strength of their handshakes and that kind of thing, which is rather odd when you start to think about it. So maybe a more egalitarian way of greeting one another where everybody's on the same playing field, so to say.
Actually, you go back far enough in history, nobody would ever shake hands with a stranger. You only shook hands with people who shared your viral community, because shaking hands with a stranger was a way to kill yourself.
I think you're absolutely correct. And I think we, in a way, need to start thinking that way, even though it's perhaps not that dire.
Yeah, and of course, across cultures it varied too. There was the Indian Namaste, for example, which was very safe from afar and uniformly to everyone.
I can report from group 5. I was an outlier in the group and probably with this entire group in that I'm not a designer or an architect. And I'm seeing, and our group I think was seeing, that every aspect of our lives is being impacted by COVID and the aftermath of COVID. Everything from the design of office buildings. Have we created systems that simply are not workable into the future? And do we need to rethink how that's done? Everything from bathroom design in office buildings to how to get from one floor to another without using a tight, compact space. We talked about employee accountability and working from home, and whether or not there needs to be changes in how we think about education so that we're focusing attention on what it means to be personally accountable and professionally accountable in a remote office kind of experience. Maybe it takes ethics to a new place. The whole issue of accessibility and equity when it comes to broadband use. And we were thinking of that domestically, but as someone pointed out earlier, that's a worldwide issue that would have to be addressed as we think about our office places today. That captures maybe a few of the thoughts or concerns that were addressed in Group 5.
Thank you, James. That was great.
Thank you. I'd like to invite either Anne or Chi from Group 12 to give us some summaries of what they discussed in the breakout room. I think that's one group.
In the meantime, I also see some comments from the chat here. Salvador talking about there's a movement in Mexico within young successful architects who are taking social media very seriously and about also thinking about different ways to learn architecture. Referring back to the Bauhaus. And university and schools will be online exclusively in the future and a platform based on a subscription. So sort of new models of education and working are also with young professionals, it sounds like.
Well, think about this webinar. We have diverse group of people, students, practitioners, members of the public. I think this is an example of the new way to educate as we learn together by sharing across all these boundaries that were kept spatially apart before.
And Adrian, would you like to share your tale about distributed work already?
Yeah, I'd be willing to, as much or as little as you'd like to hear. The chat message kind of gives a summary of how I ended up there. And hello, Mr. Fisher. I took your intro course my first year in grad school, and I quite enjoyed it.
Yeah, good.
The way that I'm an independent contractor now, but the last company I worked for was entirely distributed, and their strategy was to do weekly calls with the entire team on Monday morning at 10 a.m. and they would have kind of a randomized list about who, because they wanted to keep it to an hour, and a randomized list, and you could talk about anything you wanted to. You talk about your week, you talk about your the things you're working on, you can talk about your family or anything like that, and it served to kind of keep the team, you know, knit together. And then since they're tech, they had the spreadsheet or the roster set up such that it would rotate through and make sure everybody was on a regular basis. And it provided camaraderie and a sense of being part of a group that you don't get when you're not in office together necessarily. So that was a good strategy, I felt. And then on Friday mornings, we would do basically breakout groups. And that was sort of randomly chosen. You would be put together with, 5 or so people, and then have a call and basically do the same thing. Just talk about whatever you wanted to talk about. It's like water cooler chat. You can talk about your project that you're working on, or just your personal life, tell jokes, whatever. And both of those things provided a really nice opportunity to stay in touch with your colleagues. And then this is probably less applicable now, but then we did 2 retreats per year. One was simply just a retreat to talk about the company, and then one was a working retreat where we spent half the time doing project work with our colleagues who were previously remote, and half the time talking about other practical issues. So that was I thought a fairly good way to organize this sort of thing in a distributed fashion. So I'll leave it there for the moment.
Thank you.
I was in group 12, and a couple of things came up. It wasn't very many of us, but we were looking at, she is a designer for multi-use space, multifamily units. And I live out in the country, and I have a lot of space. And we were both talking about how families are having to work together in these spaces, and how we may be changing the way houses and multifamilies are built from the open design that's been very, very popular for the last couple decades to a little bit more closed office space, finding spaces that are quiet enough, private enough. But we also talked about the challenges. I'm going to be a family and consumer sciences teacher for the first year this fall. And great time to start, but I'm looking at how do I teach hands-on classes, and she is an architecture student who's just finishing, and he's trying to finish his classes that are hands-on, and how, again with equity, but how you don't have the tools at home maybe to do some of these things. And I'm wondering if there would be some evolution of the maker spaces that have happened, where there's places you can go in and use equipment on a co-op type of space, and how that will look. Obviously right now that's not ideal, but maybe groups being able to come in and use spaces, and then looking at how that can be cleaned or time shared in a way that's safer than having a group of kids. I just think back to fall when I taught a cooking class with 32 kids in a little room with a bunch of stoves, and how challenging that kind of thing could be. And I think the same thing would be true of an architecture school where you're going to be trying to do model making.
Can I jump in and say something? I think that,
Yes,
you bring up a good point around this notion of shared versus owned. And I think that as we think about how workplaces are being pulled into sort of the digital and the physical, what we put back together. And I think this notion of sharing goes back to this question around social and community, and how do we build more equity and access? Well, if things can become more shared, you start to build bridges to folks who don't have access, who are trying to start businesses, who can really kind of together make things a little bit more accessible if you can get to sort of a shared idea of workplace that's beyond co-working, that's a little bit more community focused. So I think you raise a lot of good points, and I think that's something that maybe we'll start to see in the future.
Yes, thank you so much, Betsy, and thank you, Anne. I just wanted to let everyone know that our next discussion on August 18 focuses on educational spaces. So, Anne, I think it would be great to come back and share some of your thoughts there and work, in a collaborative way to see if we can unravel some of those issues that you raised, and also develop some long-term and short-term solutions. I'd like to invite Janice. We're almost running out of time. We have about 4 more minutes. I would like to invite Janice to give us a little bit of comments of where we'll go from here.
Sure, and I was able to sit in on one of the groups as well. So I appreciate everybody's feedbacks and comments. And like I said, it starts with understanding behavioral changes and experience changes and imagining the scenarios for how we might design the workplace. I think what was wonderful is I heard some common threads. I heard some common threads about equity or perhaps inequity that we need to resolve, and even some solutions about the sharing, the economy, or the community base, et cetera. I heard several people comment on the need to plan encounters. If we are both working in a remote, blended sort of remote and in-office experience, how do we plan those encounters, because we are missing the socialization piece of it, et cetera. And then I think the other thing that I would say is probably a commonality is the technology component. We've learned from this experience, and so there's what I was hearing is there's the technology will play a role in allowing us to still deliver part of our experiences in a remote way. Maybe that allows us to broaden the audience. Having said that, again, we need to come back to how do we make that a fair buy-in situation such that it's more of an equitable experience for all. So those are just, top of mind. I actually have about 7 pages of notes that I have been furiously writing here, so I'm anxious to kind of collect those and look through the other comments that have been posted, and just so much appreciate all of the participation from everyone.
I'd like to also invite Betsy, topic host, to give some closing comments.
Yeah, I echo what Janice said. I think that the chat, especially, people are bringing up really interesting points, I think, about this balance between home life and work life, and that I don't think in contemporary workplace design we've ever considered home life at all. It's never been a topic that's discussed. Frankly, I don't think mental and emotional health is a topic we discuss much at all either. And I think that it sounds like people are talking about, some of the things that they're learning from working from home that are benefits, but also thinking about, okay, in the future, how do we grow from there? How do we sort of give people the things that are working well now, and how do we transform from there and try to make things, I guess, more balanced? And I think that we're always striving for that, but I think the year of 2020 has pushed us to a place that we needed to go for a long time. And you guys have great insights. This was a really fun process. Thanks for letting me be part of it. And I look forward to Tom and Virajita's class. I know they have a podcast they're going to tell you about, and I would encourage us all to attend that and really think about this. The future of workplace is really in our hands, and we can't waste this time of 2020 and not really think about how we can make places healthier, happier, more sustainable, and more equitable for everybody. So I'm going to kick it back to Tom or Virajita to talk about how we can learn more.
Thank you, Betsy. Yeah, Virajita and I are co-teaching with a colleague, Megan Voorhees, a class this summer on the post-pandemic world, and there's a workplace group working on that. So we also have a blog and a podcast on the post-pandemic world, and the podcast is up on Apple, Spotify, and Google platforms if you're interested. In addition, Abby, Virajita, and I are working on a research project with Ramsey County, which is looking at delivering government services in new ways in the post-pandemic world through their libraries as well as remotely. And then in my center at the Minnesota Design Center, we're starting a project with McKnight Foundation funding, looking at the impact of the pandemic on the comp plans of all of the communities in the metro area, and how a lot of the assumptions behind the comp plans, which were just approved, have been overturned because of the pandemic, and looking at how cities will grow differently in the future. Virajita, anything to add?
Oh, that's great. And maybe we can send some links along with the wrap up, Janice and Betsy and others.
Thank you all for coming. This has been great.
Thank you so much for coming. And I just want to remind everyone, on August 18, we have another session focused on educational spaces. Thank you. And the link is on the screen, but we'll send that with notes too at the end of the session. Thank you.
Yeah.